our belief in it is innate. Perhaps it is something we glean somehow during the course of our early experiences so that it becomes a deeply entrenched mental habit. Neither of these etiologies would, by itself, confer much warrant on the principle. The history of philosophy is littered with supposedly evident, necessary, a priori principles which have ultimately proved to be neither evident nor a priori, nor true. Indeed, many versions of the cosmological argument employ a strong version of the cosmological principle, namely a principle of sufficient reason, according to which, for everything that exists, there is a reason or cause why it should exist rather than not. This principle, too, has seemed intuitive and self-evident to many, but classical formulations of it are false, at least if the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. The conflict is instructive. Interactions at the submicroscopic level are far removed from ordinary experience and stretch in various ways ordinary application of notions like causation. We should not be too surprised when our ordinary intuitions fail in such a domain. But if there is any case that severely tests and stretches our understanding of causation, it is the creation of the material universe, especially if it is thought of as creation ex nihilo. What basis can there possibly be for certainty that a cause is required here? There is, moreover, a much more humdrum case in which the principle that everything has a cause is arguably violated. According to some libertarian accounts of free agency, at least some actions, freely willed ones, violate the principle. In fact, in a part of his paper that he has omitted, Craig allows for such an account of divine agency, then permitting the required modification of the causal principle. This concession is telling not because it suggests a positive reason for holding that even the modified principle is false, but because it shows how malleable intuitions really are in this domain. Absent a better grasp of the nature of causation, it is entirely unclear whether the causal principle, in any version, is true. That is not to say, however, that an explanation of the origin of the universe which avoids appeal to brute facts won't be intellectually more appealing. Surely it's worth exploring the hypothesis of divine creation, or so surely it's worth exploring. Indeed, the cosmological argument is, in my opinion, the most promising line of argument we have for the existence of a being with at least some of the divine attributes. Here I shall have to be very brief and very selective. Of Craig's three hypotheses concerning the temporal character of divine creation, the first and third, as I understand them, require a deity who is atemporal or eternal. Because I have not been able to make intelligible to myself the notion of such a deity, I shall pass over those options and comment only on the second. I am attracted by that option in any case because, for quite independent reasons, metaphysical reasons, I am inclined to think that the existence of time and space does not depend upon there being matter or events of any kind, even divine thoughts. Here I want to raise just two questions. One, supposing God to be a temporal being, how are we to understand the claim that God is a necessary being? And two, how are we to understand the creation of matter by a non-material being? As to one, the notion of necessary being is fraught with obscurity, but we do have some help. Platonists, at least, are prepared to entertain the necessary existence of items such as numbers, propositions, and some universals. But these are all atemporal beings, and their necessity can perhaps be understood in terms of the necessary truth of related propositions of logic and mathematics. Furthermore, they are nothing like minds and cannot enter into causal relations. Their analogy to God is so distant that they provide us with precious little understanding of divine necessity. The point I might mention of worrying about necessity here is that if you don't suppose that God is a necessary being, then you can raise the question of whether a cause was required for God. That's putting it crudely. Okay. Their analogy to God is so distant that they provide us with precious little understanding of divine necessity. And this does need to be understood. Not only must God's existence be necessary, but each of his mental acts, his thoughts and volitions, must have an explanation grounded in some sort of non-accidentality. Otherwise, his willing the world into existence remains unexplained. It is one thing to assert that God's existence and mental life are not accidents, another to show how it is so. Failing the latter, we have only the schema of a theory. Moving on to question 2. Here again, the fundamental difficulty is that we have really no analogies by means of which to grasp the notion of creation of matter ex nihilo. Nothing in our experience offers a precedent. Of course, we can, I suppose, conceive of such a thing. How would this go? I suppose one thinks of a volume of space which is at first empty, and then pop, a glob of matter appears. But I can entertain a conception as bare as this one without conceiving a cause of the new matter at all. Nor do I see how adding causation in the form of a divine volition makes the thing more comprehensible. Of course, theists can retort that all basic causal relations, even those within the physical world, are ultimately like that. They are all ultimately brute facts. But if that is so, then perhaps the causal principle and the principle of sufficient reason, even if true, are ultimately less help in rendering the world intelligible than we might initially have hoped. A final footnote. As I understand the matter, we have rather good reason to deny that Genesis 1 affirms creation ex nihilo. The Genesis picture seems rather to be that God fashions the world from a primal chaos waters, whose origins are unspecified, but were probably thought to be coeval with God. I do not know when the theory of creation ex nihilo entered the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I would welcome enlightenment on that point. But I know of no secure attestation of it in Scripture or in the intertestamental literature. Thank you.
As Professor Fales has noted, Adolf Grünbaum was here in Iowa City last October as an Ida Beam visiting scholar. His evening lecture in defense of secular humanism was a real revival meeting, with many in the audience ready to shout amen, or whatever the appropriate term is under such circumstances. Greenbaum also gave a seminar in the physics department on just the issues that Professor Craig today is challenging. What can we learn from such debates? Since the conclusions of any valid argument follow from the premises, what Professor Craig has reminded us of today is how by changing or challenging certain premises, the conclusions of an argument may turn out to be entirely different. But such reasoning cuts both ways. If Greenbaum were to continue the debate, as Craig's colleague Quentin Smith has, we in turn would continue to be pulled back and forth, listening to the justifications given for premises on one side or the other. The moral I draw from such debates is that there can be no compelling arguments for the existence or non-existence of God. Purely logical arguments, such as the arguments from design or the cosmological argument, always have their opposite counterparts. In effect, we go over the Kantian antinomies in new guises, pulled from one pole to the other. That being the case, what can one say about the relationship of the Big Bang cosmological model to theology? One claim I want to make is that any theological statements made on the basis of some physical theory inevitably lead to a God of the gaps, or to use the language of theological modeling, any theological model based on some current physical theory is undermined by changes in the physical theory. The physicist Jean-Marc Lévy-Leblanc recently wrote an article in the American Journal of Physics in which he argues that the claim of the Big Bang model about a beginning of the universe some 15 billion years ago is based on a misunderstanding of the notion of time. If we use what Lévy-Leblanc calls conformal time rather than cosmological time, as is done in the Big Bang model, we would conclude that the beginning of the universe occurred in the infinite distant past. My point here is that the notion of time is very tricky in general relativity, as is already well known in the simplest model of a black hole. This is not the place to debate whether Lévy-Leblanc is correct or not. It is simply to give an example of what happens when the understanding provided by a physical theory changes. If Lévy-Leblanc is correct, does that mean that all of a sudden God did not create the universe some 15 billion years ago? Such considerations can be put even more sharply by quoting from an article written by Quentin Smith, and I quote here, "The advent of Big Bang cosmology in this century was a watershed for theists. Since the times of Copernicus and Darwin, many theists regarded science as hostile to their worldview and as requiring defense and retrenchment on the part of theism. But Big Bang cosmology in effect reversed this situation. The central idea of this cosmology, that the universe exploded into existence in a Big Bang some 15 billion years ago, seemed tailor-made to a theistic viewpoint. Big Bang cosmology seemed to offer empirical evidence for the religious doctrine of creation ex nihilo. The theistic implications seemed so clear and exciting that even Pope Pius XII was led to comment that true science to an ever-increasing degree discovers God, as though God were waiting behind each door opened by science. But the theistic interpretation of the Big Bang has not only received widespread dissemination in popular culture and official sanction, but also a sophisticated philosophical articulation. Richard Swinburne, John Leslie, and especially our speaker today, William Lane Craig, have developed powerful arguments for theism based on a well-grounded knowledge of the cosmological data and ideas. The response of atheists and agnostics to this development has been comparatively weak, indeed almost invisible. An uncomfortable silence seems to be the rule when the issue arises among non-believers, or else the subject is briefly and epigrammatically dismissed with a comment to the effect that science has no relevance to religion. The title of this article, by the way, is A Big Bang Cosmological Argument for God's Non-Existence. And this was the introduction that I just read about how Smith is arguing that this is in fact a great argument for the theist. To which I want to add, the Newtonian deterministic view of nature was made into a worldview by Laplace, who commented that he had no need of God in his deterministic worldview. Are we to conclude that every time a paradigm or theory shift occurs in science, that a new religious worldview must be formulated? When the Newtonian paradigm reigned, the atheists were triumphant. Now that quantum theory and Big Bang cosmology using general relativity theory reign, the theists are triumphant. But further changes in science are certainly not implausible. For no one, for example, has succeeded in wedding quantum theory with general relativity. Yet some form of quantum cosmology is surely crucial in attempting to understand the origins of the universe. My objection to many discussions of theological models that use science as their subject matter is that in the heat of debate, one often forgets that they are theological models. That is to say, expressions in finite human language being used to talk about God who is other than human being, or for that matter, other than any sort of being. One easily forgets the Barthian injunction about the impossibility and yet the necessity of talking about God. I want to conclude by arguing that the relationship between theology and cosmology is actually much more interesting if one focuses on the future rather than on the past, on eschatology rather than on creation. For the future deals with what we hope for that which has not yet occurred. The Big Bang models in this regard are quite bleak. Depending on how the experimental data that have been accumulating for the last 20 years or so come out, the universe will either reach some maximum size in about 30 billion years and then contract again to a highly dense state as it was in the distant past, that's what's called a closed model, or it will continue to expand indefinitely, which is called the open model. Freeman Dyson has written several articles about how life might continue in the open models. He is not very optimistic. I think not only the Christian tradition, but other religious traditions can formulate theological models that are persuasive and plausible, and yet present a more optimistic view of the future. Such theological models would serve to counteract the nihilism that is implicit in works such as Stephen Weinberg's otherwise marvelous book, The First 3 Seconds, in which he concludes with the statement, "The more we understand about the universe, the more pointless it seems to be." Thank you.
Well, I want to thank my commentators today for helping to make this discussion much more stimulating than it would have otherwise been had I simply given a lecture by myself. I'm also gratified that neither of the commentators sought to redefend Professor Grunbaum's objection. Both of them seem to agree in Dr. Fales' words that theism is a hypothesis worth exploring with regard to the creation of the universe. Nor did they offer any critique of the three alternatives that I gave with respect to God's relationship to time and creation. Instead, what we got was a series of new criticisms of theological creationism, to which some response, I think, is appropriate. Let me deal first with Dr. Klink's claim that the moral to be drawn from this whole debate is that there is no compelling argument for or against the existence of God. Now, it's difficult for me to suppress the suspicion that Professor Klink had already arrived at this conclusion prior to the debate itself, because this sort of begging out of getting into the debate in effect does nothing to refute the arguments. In a sense, it's just a refusal or an excuse for refusing to look at the arguments and to come to grips with them. And in fact, I think the position is really self-defeating. The position that because something is debatable, that therefore there's no compelling reason to believe one alternative rather than the other, I think is actually a self-defeating position. Consider the proposition that there is no compelling argument for or against the existence of God. There's no compelling argument for or against the existence of God. That is itself a proposition which is a matter of hot debate. It is one which many people would disagree with. And therefore, using the same principle, there is no good reason, there is no compelling reason to believe that there is no compelling argument for or against the existence of God. So that the very argument undermines itself. There's no reason to think that, in fact, there's no good reason to think there's no compelling argument for or against the existence of God. You can't escape getting into the debate. In other words, you've got to look at the issues. So let's look at some of the issues that were raised by my commentators. First, the principle of sufficient reason that Dr. Fales talks about. I think that really, honestly, the principle of sufficient reason is something of a red herring in this debate. Very typically, some very strong version of this principle is enunciated, such as the obtaining of any contingent state of affairs must have a reason. And then it's shown that this sort of claim cannot be defended by showing, for example, that the state of affairs that any contingent states of affairs obtain itself cannot have a sufficient reason, and then the cosmological argument is sort of dismissed without a further thought because this very strong version of the principle of sufficient reason fails. But I really don't think that's what's at the issue here. What's at issue here is the very simple and I think intuitive principle that something just can't come out of absolutely nothing. And I don't think that anybody really believes that, say, all of a sudden at this moment an Eskimo village could just pop into existence out of nothing in this room right now. I don't think any of us really sincerely believe that kind of thing can happen. And that's the real question. Can something come out of nothing without a cause? Here, quantum mechanics, referred to by Dr. Fales, doesn't really, I think, provide a good counterexample to this principle. Number one, to say that it does assumes realism with respect to quantum mechanics. And I don't know of any scientific realist even who would be so, have the temerity to affirm realism on the quantum level, rather than a sort of instrumentalism with regard to those theories. Secondly, there are available deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics. There is, for example, the de Broglie-Bohm model of the pilot wave of quantum mechanics, so that you're not necessarily stuck with indeterminism. And thirdly, even on quantum indeterminacy, things don't pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. The quantum mechanical vacuum in which virtual particles form and dissolve is most certainly not nothing. It is a sea of energy that is describable by certain equations, possesses certain physical properties. It doesn't constitute a counterexample to this notion that something cannot come out of nothing. Well, what about free agency as an exception to the principle? Well, now, let me just remind you that the principle at issue here is not that everything has a cause. I'm not claiming that. But rather that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And I do think that even acts or events that are caused by agents have a cause, namely they are caused by agents. The fact that I alluded to non-causal theories of agency was only meant to display the full range of alternatives available to the creationist in order to show, in effect, how superficial Grünbaum's critique of creationism was. One might compare my enunciation of alternative 3 with regard to divine timelessness. This is an alternative which, in fact, I myself reject. I don't hold that God is timeless after creation. But I lay this out to display the full range of alternatives available to the creationists, which Professor Grünbaum, in this case, has not even begun to consider. Well, what about the other two questions, then, that Dr. Fales raised? First, God as being temporal and both necessary. Well, I think the necessity of God's existence can be understood on analogy with the necessary existence of numbers and other abstract objects. The differences which were alluded to don't have anything to do with the necessity of his existence. With respect to his existence, I would say it's an univocal concept. To exist necessarily is to exist in all possible worlds. And that's true whether you're talking about numbers or God. With respect to God's mental acts and volitions, I would say that these are not necessary, but rather these are contingent. My appeal here is to free agency. God freely wills to create the universe, and therefore I don't think that these acts and volitions are necessary. What about the notion of creatio ex nihilo? Is this an unintelligible notion? Well, I don't have any difficulty in understanding what is meant by creation out of nothing. It means that something lacks a material cause but has an efficient cause. Now, I think that's a clear conceptual notion. Having an efficient cause doesn't make the idea of creation more comprehensible in the sense of elucidating the concept or the meaning. I think the concept or meaning is clear. Having an efficient cause helps to show how something can begin to exist. Namely, it has an efficient cause that brings it into being. And that's the way in which efficient causation can help to make the concept of creation intelligible. Finally, with respect to the biblical doctrine of creation, I would maintain that Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 does imply creatio ex nihilo. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. With respect to the primordial chaotic waters, the primordial depths, Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 to 24 makes it clear that even the primordial depths were created by God in his wisdom, and that there was a state of affairs in the actual world in which God existed alone without the depths, and that he brought these depths into being. So that I think we do have a biblical doctrine of creatio ex nihilo here. Now, is the model, therefore, that I'm proposing, this theological model, a God of the gaps theory, as Dr. Klink alleges? He says any theological model which is based on physical theory is undermined by changes in that physical theory. But my model of creation ex nihilo is not based on physical theory. On the contrary, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have always believed in this model based on Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's simply that this model predicts the origin of the universe at a finite point in the past. And today, remarkably, and contrary to all expectations, this prediction has been verified. So it's not based on the physical theory, it's based on divine revelation. It's based on the Bible, but the prediction of this model, this theological model, has come true. Finally, what about the Bartian injunction that Dr. Klink talks about concerning the impossibility of talk about God? Well, I maintain that this sort of injunction is simply self-referentially incoherent. Just consider the sentence, "It is impossible to talk about God." It is impossible to talk about God. That sentence is itself talk about God. And thus it refutes itself. It's self-referentially incoherent. So that the claim that you cannot talk about God it refutes itself. If it's true, it's false. And therefore it seems that we can discourse intelligibly about God, such as I've sought to do, and I think that on balance, there is good evidence in current physical theory for believing that this prediction of divine creatio ex nihilo made in the Judeo-Christian scriptures is in fact verified. Pardon me?
I'd like to thank all three of our speakers and give you all an opportunity at this time to ask questions of any of the speakers, and if you all want to ask questions of each other, I think you can feel free as the time permits to jump right in. I will repeat the questions as you ask them, just so that other people can hear them if they could not otherwise hear them. Yes?
I have a question for Dr. Craig. First of all, thank you for coming. You're a very interesting, powerful speaker. But as it occurs to me, this debate poses a problem, particularly for believing Christians. Because for practicing, the debate seems to be a talk between believers and non-believers. But for a practicing Christian, we understand God to be a God of revelation. And to pose our discourse on God on these premises is to decenter the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And so it occurs to me that is a weakening of the Christian position by entering into the debate in the first place. I wonder if you could address that concern.
So the question is, for practicing Christians, is this displacing this foundation of the faith by putting this issue forward rather than the life of Jesus Christ?
No, you want me to speak into this microphone? Yes. Okay. Well, I thought I tried to deal with that in my response to Professor Klink. Namely, I'm not basing this doctrine on physical science. My appeal or my basis is divine revelation. Christians have always believed this, even when the evidence was against it. Even when the models of the universe, such as, say, the steady state theory, were equally cogent with respect to the observational evidence. So it's not at all based on the evidence or based on the current physical theory. I'm simply saying that this is a model for understanding creation which makes a prediction which is now verified by current physical theory. So I don't in any way want to undermine or impugn divine revelation.
Yes.
I have one question for Professor Craig and a comment that the other two might want to respond to. Don't try to encapsulate it. I don't know whether you would be able to. It goes like this. Here's the comment. That Professor Klink says that we're sort of in an age where the theists have won the day. In reality, silence might be the silence that one has when impressed with such an incoherent kind of statement that one is simply nonplussed. For instance, Asimov responds this way to an argument by Fish that some of you may know from thermodynamics, the existence of God. And Asimov says that physicists should not be silent because he worries about the hidden armies of the night, which actually was called the hidden agenda. I don't mean to suggest anything like that, but rather it might be much to say that theists have won the day. My own sentiments are that I worry that perhaps the arguments are indeed so based on a misunderstanding of physical principles that many physicists are moved to silence. The second sort of comment that's directed at the respondent is this business of no arguments, no compelling arguments for or against the existence of God. I actually hold that view, but one must be careful about what that view is. There's no hard empirical evidence could be assessed for or against the existence of God, because the nature of God, once interpreted in a theistic way, is not an empirical kind of entity. It's an entity that can do whatever he wants to do, anytime he wants to do, and so on and so forth. It's not something that you can have empirical evidence for or against, unless you're willing to say, something physical, like a rock, could wind up being God, you're committed to that. Right, I'm sorry, I don't take a lot of time, but those are the comments. Now the question. Right? Up to the question. And that is, I'm puzzled a little bit about the notion of phenomenal time, as I would call it, a time that's not physical time that you suggest might be possible here. I thought the argument was to come from physics, and therefore one, it seems to me, cannot appeal to time as it is phenomenally conceived in order to argue that we have a kind of concept of time which makes intelligible a creator, which is before physical time, or out of physical time. If the argument is to come from physics, I don't see how you can appeal to phenomenology to give us the argument. And I'm wondering how we might apply that. Thanks very much.
All right, let me try to deal with these in the order that they were given. First, I feel almost certain